right. Now it's time for some food for thought. What we're going to do, Michael, is we're going to talk about how important the fuel that you're going to be getting to your brain. We call it food for thought, but there's actually two parts to the fuel that you're going to put in your brain, two sources. One is located in your stomach after you've eaten something. We'll talk a little bit about that.
I see where you're going. Okay.
And what's the other one?
Well, I guess you're saying what you put in your brain.
What you put in your brain. But there's two of them. One is food, and that's what you first think of, nutrition for my brain. It's the food I eat. We'll talk about how important that is, but there's one that some people are surprised at how important another fuel for the brain might be, and I'm going to test you. You didn't know I was going to do this.
No.
Okay, I'm going to give you a hint. Listen.
Okay.
Okay.
Oxygen.
Oxygen, exactly. When people don't have oxygen in their brain on a regular basis, and we hope a large dose every so often, the brain gets oxygen deprived. When we talk about someone who has a sleep apnea, for instance, we'll get into that in the next cogwheel, but someone who has sleep apnea is not getting full oxygen to their brain. We know that the brain lives and dies on oxygen within minutes. A stroke is cutting off the oxygen to a part of the brain, the blood flow. And it's not the food that's in the blood, it's not the minerals of omega-3s and antioxidants that the brain needs within those minutes of life, it's the oxygen. If someone doesn't have oxygen for a few minutes, they will die. For a few minutes, the part of the brain will die. So that's how important oxygen is. But we forget about the fact that you have a chance, especially if you live in a wonderful climate with fresh air, you have a chance to take a deep breath every so often, and you do it for your brain. And our last cogwheel talking about mindfulness, one of the things that in the mindfulness study show that if you take a deep breath, a real deep breath, you end up not only relaxing, focusing on that breath, but we think that what we can do is also add that to the fuel. You add a little bit of nutrition to your brain through the deep breath process.
Excellent point, yeah. So then the other part of it is
it's food.
Food. What you put in your gut. And,
exactly.
Seems like this is increasingly important, that the more and more of the diseases that are associated that sort of fall into this whole cascade that we talk about that leads to neurodegeneration and dementia. So many of these diseases are influenced by what we eat, how much we eat, the type of food we eat.
When we eat it.
When we eat it.
If you think of the fuel system that we've got, we have the two, and one is the immediate, and that's your think tanks, is what I call them with your lungs. And then the tank that's going to sustain you over days. This is in the form of minutes. This is in the form of days. You are what you eat. And once you eat junk food, there's nothing that the brain can get except whatever is in the stomach to be delivered. And it will affect both the structure of the brain, the growth of the brain. It'll affect your cognitive functioning and your decision making depending on what type of fuel you put in, when you put it in what quantities.
Okay, so you started sort of giving some advice by saying not junk food. What do you mean by junk food?
Anything that's processed, Michael, you can start saying, let's question whether or not that has been processed for a reason that is not brain healthy. And if the reason is to keep it on the shelf for a long time and certain things are stripped out because they spoil, then maybe it's the things that you are taking out that should have been in something you're going to eat. So a long shelf life may be a short shelf life for your brain. But if the processing leaves in the ingredients, and you can't necessarily trust the front of the box saying loaded with this or that, you just have to do your research, and that sometimes is difficult. We like to say fresh is best. If you can't get fresh, then just make sure that what you're getting keeps the processing at a very minimum. And anything that you can do to find out how much of the antioxidants on one side and the omega-3s, those are the two we focus on. Only, not that those are the only things you need to ingest when you eat food, but those are the things that have been the most studied, the two. So let's talk about those for just a little bit. Antioxidants, what do you think that we should explain generally? What do you look for?
Well, I think people have to understand that what happens when you breathe in, part of that process is the release of free radicals. And these are molecules that will latch on, they need to latch on to other molecules, and that's a destructive thing. So
Let me back up for a
Okay.
second. And that's it. You said when we breathe in oxygen. When we drink water, H2O,
oxygen.
we ingest. When we live in an atmosphere that happens to be full of oxygen, you get it through your skin. You can't get away from oxygen getting in. We want to have it. But when you burn the oxygen, when I lifted my arm, I burned a little bit of oxygen. When I think, so think of a giraffe. You got it? I just thought, think of a green giraffe. And when you thought of a giraffe, a green giraffe, if we had Michael in an imaging machine or had you in a machine, we could see some electrical activity because the blood flowed to where you were thinking of that bright green giraffe. And at that point, Michael, the oxygen that is the fuel gets burned. That burning process is the transformation into a different type of a chemical because you've burned it. And that becomes, you said, free radical. Oh, it's also called radical oxygen. Because we heat our home with a wood stove, I like to tell Michael, it's like the wood is really good but the ash that's left over is toxic. You have to clean it out. So how do free radicals clean it out?
Well, your body produces certain antioxidants, as I understand it, but frequently not enough. If we're putting too much stress on and creating too many free radicals, then we have to find antioxidants from the food we eat, and that's one of the reasons that it's important to eat like berries and colorful
Bright colors.
Bright colors. Apparently, it's the antioxidants in the skin that create that color.
Yeah.
Is that right?
An easy example is that if you have an apple and you skin it, the red apple, then the antioxidant level of what you've eaten has been reduced because a lot of it is in the pigment itself. That's why green grapes and red grapes are two different antioxidant levels because of the color. So blueberries, bright colors. One of the, in fact, the world champion of all antioxidant substances other than spices, which are ground and really fine, I'll tell you about those in a minute, is something that used to be called prunes. When you and I grew up, we had prunes.
They're not called prunes anymore?
They are not called prunes. So let's bring you up to date.
Yeah.
They are now called dried pitted plums, and they cost more than prunes, you know, because of the fancy label.
Right.
But what we did when we were doing our trials and educating elders, somebody asked about prunes. We looked it up. Prunes have more antioxidant level than pound for pound, ounce for ounce, than any other substance. So if you get 3 of those per day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, one at night, that gives you approximately, according to Tufts, about half of the antioxidant protection you need for that day. And remember, we tell everybody it's a daily battle. It isn't possible to eat enough antioxidants to cover tomorrow, today, and say I'm good. Or if I forget to eat any antioxidants today, I can't make that up tomorrow. Because the free radicals that are produced when you burn oxygen stay in your system and do damage for that day. And once that damage is done, you can't undo the damage. It's not going to kill you or hurt you for one day, but if over a long period of time you don't have enough of the antioxidants, that's when the flushing out or the washing out of the damaging substances simply doesn't take place.
So this is why the recommendation to have a balanced diet and a Mediterranean diet makes sense, because you need a large portion of fruits and vegetables to get the antioxidants. You need the bread for something else.
Exactly. Now, in that Mediterranean diet, which is probably the takeaway of, if you had to give somebody 2 words, those are the 2 words. Eat that, follow that, and then learn how to fine-tune it. But in that diet, you've got olive oil, and you've got nuts, and you've got fish. That's the omega-3 group. And we now know, and that's the other 2 we're going to talk about in this short segment on nutrition. What's been found is that the omega-3s that you need to have, those are essential oils for your brain. And Michael, you and I never take offense when people call you a fathead because we're all about 60, 70% fat. The myelin that winds around your axon, the myelin sheath, is the substance that really goes into that is the omega-3s that you eat. So if you starve yourself of omega-3s, then the resources that the glial cells need to actually create that sheath, just not there.
And the myelin facilitates the connection between the brains and the communication, right? So if you're breaking up the myelin, you're breaking up the brain's ability to communicate with itself. Yeah.
That's perfect, because a communication line like a wire that's going to be used for a telegraph, if it's not insulated, if an electrical wire is not insulated, then you're going to have communication problems. The same thing with the communication or the speed of processing within the brain with axons. And you know, axons can be so small, they go from one group of neurons to another, or you can have an axon that is several feet long connecting your brain to your finger here.
Right.
So when those connections are compromised because you're not getting the myelin, it may be because you're not getting those omega-3s. There are good fats and bad fats, and luckily the omega-3 balance, the essential oil balance, is a weekly. Remember, antioxidants is daily. In the balance of omega-3s, it processes differently, and as long as you get spread out through the week, a good dose of those, you don't, and I like to say, you don't have to give up all of the omega-6s at all, because you have to have some of those, but never fight to get them because they're everywhere.
We've got too many of them, right? It's so
In
ubiquitous
processed
that
food.
we're, yeah,
In processed food. But when I first started this, and I would explain to people that these are the things you need to have, and those are the nuts like walnuts and pecans and almonds, and unfortunately cashews and peanuts are not on the list, but you can eat those if you can tolerate. But when you've got the deep water fish, and when you've got avocados, and when you've got things that can get into your brain within the Mediterranean diet, then if you're going to eat a donut, or if you're going to eat one of those omega-6 rich foods, just know that week you'd better load up on a little additional fish or olive oil.
Because you need to have a balance between the two, isn't that right?
Exactly. You need, and you know what the balance used to be in our great-grandfather's day, before processed foods, was about a 2 or 4 to 1, and that means 4 times as much omega-6s as 3. So that's the balance. Some thought earlier it was about 2 to 1. Today the balance is speculated to be 20 to 1.
So we're getting way too many.
Way too many. And the
omega-6s.
younger brains especially, that their brains are driving through the nutrition life with fast food all day and every day. There's speculation that that's going to tip it over, so those developing brains that are getting a lot more need to develop the wiring than you and I are, what we're seeing is the potential of a disaster unless that balance is somehow shifted back.
Yeah. All right, so just the Mediterranean diet, so that we make clear, that's like focuses on vegetables, fruits, not so much meat.
Plant-based.
Plant-based, right. A little bit of fish.
Yes, a little bit of
fish, olive oil, you're
Right.
saying, is a good one. So the other point that I want to sort of just throw in here before we get off of diet, if we're ready to get off of it, one of the things that I've been exploring for the revisions on the book is the whole new phenomenon that people are discovering about the gut biome.
Yes, yes.
What is going on?
We ought to do another segment on that, but give a preview.
Well, scientists are now discovering we have thousands of different populations of bacteria that live in a symbiotic relationship with us. They're not us, they are them, but it's a symbiotic relationship. Our health is very much determined by the type and the health of the good bacteria in our gut. One of the things they're finding, we've said that we've talked about in other segments, the Western cluster diet and metabolics.
You mentioned that years ago, but only recently have you said now the science is shining a light on it. So could you go through that?
Well, one of the things that they're finding, the more diverse species of bacteria that you have in your gut, the better off you are, because each one sort of targets a different toxin and takes care of a different thing, or does a different supply. Supplies a different function. And one of the things they're finding now is that the Western diet that also leads to heart attacks and
you're going to
stroke
define
and so
in
on.
a minute what the Western diet is.
If I can remember all of those details.
No details, but just generally. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this segment will be 20 minutes long. But
That's right.
This
No,
is worth it. This is new stuff.
Yeah. what that's doing is actually causing whole species of bacteria to go into extinction.
This is the Western diet.
The Western diet.
Okay.
So those of us who live in the industrialized nations in the West have a less diverse biome, gut biome.
Than our ancestors.
Than our ancestors or
anyone
people
else on
who
Earth.
live in underdeveloped
Really?
nations. So they are better able to have diverse sort of protection than our gut is. And the bacteria there have this incredible effect on all the rest of the system. One of the things I'll just mention briefly, if you don't feed a particular bacteria well, one of the things that happens is that the lining of the intestines becomes permeable. That means that fluids can go in and out of it. So stuff starts leaking out of the guts.
Stuff that you don't want to leak.
Stuff that you don't want to leak, like poisons and bad bacteria. That
Wow.
causes a whole immune response that becomes systemic.
All of a sudden it starts cascading in a bad way.
It starts that whole cascade that we've talked about
Wow.
before. So you need to feed your gut, the food that they want in order to
I've got a
keep them
million
healthy.
questions here, but are the formulas now being worked on as to what you feed and how often you feed the gut?
They're trying to figure that out.
Okay.
You've heard about probiotics.
Sure.
And that's like when you eat yogurt.
But 5 years ago, no one knew. Now it's on TV.
Yeah, now it's everything.
Okay.
What a probiotic is trying to take a kind of bacteria that's contained in the yogurt and insert it into your gut. So you're introducing a new bacteria, and the hope is that it's one that's needed and it'll help balance things out. A little bit iffy, whether we know enough to know how to do that. There's another thing called prebiotics.
So you got anti, you got pro, and this is pre. What's that?
Prebiotics. Prebiotics are food that bacteria like. So it's taking stuff, you're actually feeding the bacteria, not for yourself, not for your own body, but you're feeding the bacteria. And if we get to the point where we can figure out which are the bacteria that are struggling, or which
We'll see it on labels of food in the grocery store. Well, I can see it.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I'm just realizing is we're getting way off track,
Yeah.
but this is brand new stuff, is that if those protective barriers are being changed by the diet that comes in, that is the processed foods and some of the questions of why we can't get better food in, let's go to the brain, wouldn't the leakage and the failure of that protective biotic formula that you were born with, your ancestors had, once that's changed, wouldn't the damaging chemicals, toxins be able to then go through the blood into the brain, and we're setting up some problems up there that we haven't quite anticipated?
Oh yeah, I mean, it causes systemic problems, and when we, in the other segments, when we've talked about this cascade of risk factors, what this does is set up those risk factors that are on one of the early levels where that starts this whole cascade that goes up to the brain. It causes your whole body, causes diseases. They're thinking now that cancers and some of the chronic diseases may well start because of these problems with the bacteria either not being there or not being fed properly and not functioning the way they should be.
We didn't go off the rails, but what we did was to get into an area that I think I'm going to reframe, and this isn't, I was going to say, Michael, what a terrible note to end on, but what we're doing is we're giving a signal to these students that this is being studied in depth and it's being studied seriously, and that we're going to be seeing some changes and giving some options for people that are really going to be effective. But again, they have to be the ones who actually understand what to put in there and how it works. So that explanation, I think, when you finish the chapters on that revision within that, it's so new that we don't know what the final chapter is going to be.
Yeah, it's emerging science, but we need to at least have it on our radar screen because it affects our health and how our brain works.
We may have debuted it here by accident. Thank you.